if we can compare Aristotle's Rhetoric, the work of the second half of the 4th century BC, to Cicero's Rhetoric, which was finished in 55 BC, the answer yet is that we can. Actually, there are several reasons for that. First of all, Cicero himself states that very clearly in 2 letters of his. He had written his treatise Aristotelio More, like Aristotle, in Aristotle's way. Basically, Cicero, by stating that, had in mind the now lost dialogue of Aristotle, the Gryllus, a rhetorical treatise earlier than the Rhetoric, which presumably was written in the manner of Plato's Gorgias. But unlike his teacher, Aristotle led the interlocutors, amongst whose was the writer himself, to present analytically their views on the issue at hand. Besides, Cicero had read Aristotle's Rhetoric, as it is obvious in the oratore, e.g., from a remark the orator Mark Antony is making in it. Furthermore, Aristotle's Rhetoric is a text consisting of lectures on rhetoric given at the Academy. So, it is almost certain that in his Rhetoric, Aristotle conveys for his students the ideas he supported in his Gryllus on the issue several years earlier, definitely enriching them. Additionally, it has been convincingly supported long ago that Aristotle's Rhetoric, in its greater part, is an expanded Phaedrus, the Plato's well-known philosophical treatise, which severely criticizes the appliance rhetoric of its era and proposes the right one on a philosophical basis. Clearly then, both the Gryllus and the Rhetoric echo and expand Plato's options on rhetoric, and so, to a large scale, comprise common ideas. Of course, Aristotle added the scientific argumentation and psychology to meet Plato's demand for the orators having real knowledge of his issue and his audience's psychology. There are some other reasons, but I will omit them in order to save time. Consequently, from the 3 parameters of rhetoric, according to Aristotle, i.e. the orator, his issue, and the audience, I have chosen the last one as the most suitable for my research. Apparently, the audience is treated by Aristotle and Cicero in a manner which is indicative, far above the other 2 parameters, of the nature and the problems of the politics in Athens around 335 BC and in Rome at the beginning of the 1st century BC, which is the date when the discussion of the Rhetoric is supposed to take place, respectively. The audience in Aristotle's Rhetoric. Anyone reading Aristotle's Rhetoric has the impression that it was written by a man who had a lot of complaints about Athens' democracy in the second half of the 4th century BC. Otherwise, it is very difficult to justify the fact that the rhetorical handbook explicitly states that its very theme is necessary evil. In fact, according to Aristotle, every public speaker should be limited to the proof, omitting anything else as superfluous, periirgon. There is a handout, a few handouts spread around, you can read them. But because the orator has to do with the corruption of the hearer, he must pay attention to these superfluous things in order not to be defeated, which is very dangerous for the community, especially since it is recognized here that there is a moral obligation for the orator to support right against wrong. Under these conditions, rhetoric is technique, i.e. science, and its task is not persuasion, but the identification of the convincing and seemingly convincing means at each issue, as medicine's task is not to achieve absolute, but at least relevant health. Accordingly, based on the hearer, Aristotle distinguishes 3 genera of orations. The hearer is either present and just watches, without being asked to decide on something, or a judge. In the second case, it is possible to judge about the past or the future. So we have epidictic, forensic, and deliberative orations, respectively. The term for the kind of hearer who decides on things to come is ecclesiastes. which means that Aristotle had in mind the democratic politics of his era when the People's Assembly was the dominating state body. Nevertheless, Aristotle used the above derogatory terms to characterize the members of such an assembly. Despite, however, the corruption, the vulgarity for ecotis, and the pure judgment, pavlotis, of the hearer, the moral basis of rhetoric is steadfast on Aristotle. Thus, he argues that rhetoric is useful because true and fair things which the orator is required to highlight are naturally more powerful than their opposites. But because rhetoric is an art that appeals to the many, the orator should respect that fact and resort to common grounds in topic to persuade away from the scientific style of teaching, which does not fit here, since the basic premise under which the orator must deliver his speech is that the hearer is a simple man, with not necessarily high intellectual performance. That last observation doesn't mean, of course, that the orator must fall to the level of the naive members of the crowd to ensure persuasion. The real meaning is that the orator must be concentrated on how to say what he wants, and not just rely on the good faith of the audience and on the strength of the truth alone. Moreover, he will be naive himself if he is satisfied with them, since it has been already argued that the educated orator is less convincing than the uneducated one before the mob, and that must be tackled effectively. Consequently, according to Aristotle, the best way to properly address the audience, as in Plato's Phaedrus, is the knowledge of human psychology in general and of each specific audience particularly. So the first part of the second book is devoted to the analysis of emotions and categories of hearers. These categories are formed by age and social criteria. For the latter, Aristotle assumes an average social group and therefore refers only to deviations from it. The nobles, the rich, and the powerful ex officio, the nati. For the first two cases, Aristotle does not seem to have great respect. Nobility is something positive, but it has upward and downward trends from generation to generation, while the rich are said to be often pretentious and self-indulgent. For the powerful, however, the case is different. They have values and more manly manners than the rich, while being more studious because of their position and more magnificent as well. Accordingly, Aristotle, on the beginning of the second book of his Rhetoric, makes clear that, given the characters of the hearers, the orator will formulate properly his speech in order to influence them positively on his issue, which is very important, especially in cases of delivering forensic speeches. Besides, knowing well the virtues will help the orator to present properly his own character, which is vital this time in delivering a political speech. Within that framework, the exams from history and the sophisticated style, lexis, in terms of avoiding the excesses in each case by exploiting the proper, prepon, prescribed on the basis of moderation, mesotis, between the two ends of the humble and the arrogant, but also the smart and popular expressions are proposed as very effective by Aristotle. From the chapter of composition, synthesis, Aristotle also proposes periodic structure, i.e. parallel or antithetical sentences, preferably short ones, which can be easily recalled, the avoidance of using multiple links, and the variety of rhetorical means, mainly metaphors, as the most useful for prose poetry invention that has impressive impact on the hearers. The thing is completed with the discussion of the desired rhythm of prose, preferably at the beginning and the end of a phrase, the pean, presumably introduced by Thrasymachus, the sophist, running as the best option. The rhythm has to do with the fourth part of classical rhetoric, which was known at Aristotle's era, i.e. delivery, hypocrisis. Aristotle considers delivery as very important for persuasion, and notes that it only concerns voice which must be adapted to the feelings in each situation. The volume, tone, and rhythms are the voice parameters the orator utilizes to make it effective. In In this regard, rhetoric resembles the dramatic race, where the prizes are won because of the actors and not of the poets, precisely because of delivery. So the orator who will prevail with this weapon can persuade, even if he is wrong. The basis of that distortion is, once again, the corruption of the hearer. As for the order, taxes, indicated in each speech, and especially in deliberated ones, Aristotle is much more frugal than his contemporaries, as he tells us with minimum courtesy. Now they are dividing in a ridiculous way, that's what he said. Perhaps he meant Isocrates. He considered as necessary for the orator only the presentation of his theme and then the argument supporting it. Usually, however, a speech also included an exordium and an epilogue. Aristotle's view that the style of a deliberative speech before the people, which is considered as a more difficult genus than the forensic one, since the former has to do with the well-being and the monia of the citizens, looks like a sketch that can make a positive impression only from afar, because it is not so accurate, is also very interesting. Indeed, it is argued that the higher the number of the hearers is, the less will be the accuracy of the speech. It is therefore evident that in the deliberated genus, before the crowd, historical examples are more suitable than syllogisms and themimata, while amongst the latter, those aiming at refutation, electica, are more popular than demonstrative, dictica, because they lead more easily to understanding by presenting the opposites. Even the omission of syllogism is acceptable as far as the orator projects his impeccable morality, suggesting that deliberative oratory before the crowd for Aristotle is above all projection of virtue models. Those are said as opposed to the forensic style where the orator should insist in accuracy, especially if the judge is one person, in which case rhetoric should be reduced, a phrase very much indicative of what rhetoric really means for Aristotle. It is the beautiful dress that the orator creates and puts it on the truth in her public appearances to highlight the beauty of the total, based on the principle of the proper, prepon, that springs from the great Aristotelian philosophical concept of mesotis. The audience in Cicero's De Oratore. From the two main persons discussing in De Oratore, I will omit the orator Mark Antony and concentrate upon Lucius Licinius Crassus, 140 to 91 BC, because the latter expresses more essential rhetorical views, the former being less sophisticated as an orator, and because Cicero stresses that Crassus was an outstanding orator in speeches before the crowd, which is the very core of rhetoric. Besides, I have already mentioned the special relationship between Crassus and Cicero, which in the latter's mind recalled the relationship between Socrates and Plato. Crassus, although he believed that the best school for rhetoric was the public life of Rome, its institutions and the mos maiorum, ancestral custom, did not denounce Greek culture. Instead, he considered that education as essential for the perfect Roman orator. So, he showed a real interest in obtaining first-hand knowledge of it. He traveled to Athens and attended philosophical schools. Therefore, Crassus was very much influenced by Greek education. Subsequently, the reception of Greek standards should not take place, according to Crassus, through a sterile imitation or copying. The best way for a Roman to benefit from the speeches of the Greek orators is to try to present them freely in Latin, and not to translate them faithfully. That way he will have to use excellent vocabulary, but also to create new words in order to reach the Greek standard level. The benefit is obviously double for the Roman orator from such a method. He both enriches Latin vocabulary and becomes an emancipated orator. Crassus considered rhetoric to be a distinct science. The key elements of that science, according to him, are five, as many as the classic parts of rhetoric. The orator should speak with enter, with knowledge, composite, with method, ornate, with charm, memoriter with retentive memory, and finally, cum quandam etiam actionis dignitate with a certain distinction of delivery. In addition to that knowledge, though, comes the orator's moral character, a kind of rhetoric ethics which guarantees that this mighty weapon of human spirit will only be used to defend and promote the common good. The orator, equipped with those weapons, will address his audience, which originally is referred to as any gathering of people. The measure of the orator's success will be the level to which he managed to preserve that gathering and ensure its favor towards his issue, especially being able to govern this favor and shift it to any direction he wishes and to remove it from anywhere he wants. This ultimately is the meaning of the phrase that eloquence is actually one thing. With regard again to the audience, Crassus notes that it has to do with the places where speeches are delivered, namely the forum, the contio, an informal assembly of the people took place before the voting procedures, the judicium and the senatus. So it is obvious that the deliberative genus in Republican Rome provided two scenes to the orator, the Senate and the rostra, the platform for the orator in the Forum Romanum. The task then for the orator of the Respublica, who has to speak as an accomplished statesman in all these places, the forum being a common place for every kind of oratory, is threefold, i.e. as many as his potential audiences. Accordingly, he has to turn the passion of the people, the consciences of the judges, and the authority of the Senate to the direction he wants, always, of course, serving the public interest. Besides, the philosophical and aesthetic principle of the proper, aptum, which recalls Aristotle's prepon, according to Crassus, should be applied in rhetoric. The basis for aptum is knowledge, prudentia. So, the orator has to be an orator doctus, an educated orator, to be able to find what is aptum in any case. It is also obvious that on the grounds of aptum, the hearer plays an important role in choosing the right rhetoric, being opened here free and not to, as in the Greek case, possibilities from his position as a judge. The rhetoric before the Senate, the rhetoric of the contio, and finally, the rhetoric of the courts. That internal distinction of the deliberative genus, apart from the classical and known since Aristotle's era in tripartite, i.e. deliberative, forensic, and epidictic genus, is an essential contribution of Roman oratory and rhetoric. The former, rhetorical practice, was a vivid reality in Rome due to the kind of polity the Respublica was, and the latter, rhetorical theory, was enriched by the gradual influx of Greek culture in Rome, in such a way indeed that the whole process be regarded not as a sterile imitation, but as an ongoing evolutionary and somehow natural course to the only level that could keep this culture alive and flourishing, namely the political level for existence. Thank you. In this context, especially the political weapon of Greek rhetoric finds fertile ground in the Respublica, where it is exploited and evolves dynamically. Now, the characteristics that rendered Crassus an distinguished orator in general and in Contiones in particular were his supreme authority, auctoritas, his humor and wit, which did not disrupt that authority, and his urban elegance as opposed to the obscenity of other orators. His language was the pure and correct Latin which he attained without pretense. His argumentation was clear and excellent, while he was well aware of the written and unwritten law. Therefore, he was unsurpassed in the interpretation of events, in giving definition of things, and explaining what was just in any case. To those one must thank Crassus's excellent preparation before delivering a speech, his exemplary delivery, which avoided the extremes, and his impetuous diction expressing successfully, when needed, his anger and just indignation, the most genuine political characteristics of a consistent supporter of the Respublica who had dignity, dignitas, and was a rival of the demagogues. We'll omit a few things and proceed to conclusions. From the previous analysis, it is clear that Aristotle's rhetoric and Cicero's the oratory, apart from their common ideas on rhetoric, obviously based on the democratic nature of both the Athenian and the Roman polities of their era, differ considerably on the way each writer deals with a popular audience. So Aristotle does not hesitate to severely criticize the Athenian audience of around 335 BC, using the derogatory characterizations of being corrupted, vulgar, and full of judgment, while Cicero, on the other hand, through the words of the famous orators Mark Antony and especially Lucius Licinius Crassus, praises the dignity of the Roman people of 91 BC and their virtues, which had rendered the rhetoric of the Conti of the Orator supreme sin. The reason for that discrepancy is that Athens of around 335 BC had lost its role as a leading democratic city-state in the Greek world. The demagogues in Athens were considered by many as responsible for the city's decline, actually started after Pericles' death in 429 BC. The Greeks of the north, Philip's first, and then Alexander's Macedonians, had since the Battle of Chaeronea 338 BC replaced the glorious city in its leading position. But the Macedonians had no democracy, so rhetoric inevitably declined too. Within that historical context, Aristotle wrote his Rhetoric, which echoes the political atmosphere in Athens, i.e. the injudiciousness of the demagogues and the willingness of a part of the citizens to follow them, and underlines the necessity for serious rhetoric on a philosophical basis. On the other hand, in finishing, Cicero, by his rhetorical treatise, the Oratore, revives the political atmosphere in Rome before the civil wars. Accordingly, his personae are enjoying Rome's leading position in the Mediterranean world, for which they considered as the root cause their res publica, Livius also did. So, given the substantial role of the people in the res publica, the interlocutors in the Oratore could not blame the popular audience in Rome for something. Of course, Cicero witnessed the turbulence that followed after 90 BC, and in 55 BC, when he finished his treatise, he clearly saw what Caesar wanted to do with the res publica. Perhaps Crassus' single warning in the De Oratore about the existence in Rome of a rumble of rusticity thrown in our public places, giving opportunity even to the most faulty speakers, is a prelude of what was a disappointing reality in 55 BC.